Every astronaut who ever flew both a moon mission and a space shuttle mission can be counted on one hand with fingers left over. The true number is exactly 2, and after this video, that number can never grow because both men who share this distinction are now gone. Which means whatever this line on a resume used to be worth, it just became permanently unrepeatable. Nobody alive today, and nobody who will ever be born, can add a third name to it. I went through the full flight logs of every Apollo, Gemini, and shuttle astronaut NASA ever put on a roster to confirm it. Out of hundreds of people who have flown to space for the United States, only 2 crossed that specific bridge. You'd assume the most famous moonwalkers all went on to fly the shuttle too, since NASA kept plenty of them on staff for years afterward, but almost none of them ever strapped into an orbiter again. Neil Armstrong didn't. Buzz Aldrin didn't. Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, didn't either. One of these 2 men was pulled off the most famous crisis mission in NASA history days before launch, for a reason that had nothing to do with his skill, and then spent 4 sleepless days making sure that mission's crew came home alive anyway. The other did something so specific with his body on the lunar surface that NASA still uses the photograph today, decades later, as one of its defining images, and I'm saving exactly what he did, and the 6 words he said years later that tied the whole story together for the end. Picture a man standing in a crew quarters at the Kennedy Space Center in early April 1970. 3 days from a launch he has trained for over a year, when a flight surgeon tells him he's been exposed to German measles and he is off the mission. That man is Thomas Kenneth Mattingly II, and the mission is Apollo 13. Mattingly had joined NASA in 1966, part of Astronaut Group 5, after years as a Navy aviator and test pilot. He was assigned as command module pilot for Apollo 13, training alongside Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes for months. Then, days before the April 1970 launch, doctors flagged his exposure to measles. He'd never had the disease as a child, so NASA couldn't risk him getting sick 200,000 miles from Earth. Jack Swigert took his seat instead. Mattingly never caught the measles at all. He watched the launch from the ground on April 11, 1970, and 3 days later, that decision put him at the center of the rescue. It's the early hours of April 14, 1970, inside the Mission Simulation and Training Facility at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, and Mattingly hasn't slept. Hours earlier, an oxygen tank in the service module of Apollo 13 tore itself apart 200,000 miles from Earth, and Houston, we've had a problem, came down the line. Now the crew is crammed into the lunar module Aquarius, using it as a lifeboat, while the command module Odyssey sits powered down and freezing, its batteries hoarded for the one maneuver that matters, re-entry. Nobody has ever restarted a spacecraft from a full cold shutdown in flight. There is no checklist for it. So Mattingly climbs into the simulator, an exact twin of the capsule now drifting dark in space, and starts throwing switches. Guidance, environmental control, communications, the pyrotechnics that will fire the parachutes. Every system draws power, and the crew has under 30 amps to spend on all of it combined, with nothing left over for a mistake. He runs the sequence, overshoots the budget, starts again. Overshoots again. Engineer John Aaron works the numbers beside him, hunting for hidden circuits bleeding amps they can't spare. Outside the simulator door, other controllers are fighting parallel crises, carbon dioxide building past safe limits in Aquarius, a trajectory that has to be nudged by hand with a dead guidance computer. 3 men getting colder and thirstier by the hour as onboard water rationing kicks in. None of that is Mattingly's problem to solve. His is narrower and just as unforgiving. Find the sequence, or the crew has nothing to come home in. By the time he finds one that lands under the ceiling, the procedure runs to nearly 40 pages, and it has to be read up to the crew line by line, switch by switch, over a radio link 200,000 miles long, with zero room for a hand to slip on the wrong toggle. On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, and the USS Iwo Jima pulls all three men out alive. Lovell would later credit Mattingly's power-up sequence with the difference between a working spacecraft and a dead one at re-entry. The astronaut who lost his seat to a disease he never caught had just saved the men who took it. 2 years later, NASA gave him the seat he should have had all along, just on a different flight. On April 16, 1972, Mattingly launched as command module pilot on Apollo 16, orbiting the moon alone in the command module Casper, while his crewmates flew the lunar module Orion down to the Descartes highlands below. He never set foot on the surface. On the way home, on April 25th, he did something almost as rare as walking on the moon itself. He opened the hatch and stepped outside the spacecraft in deep space, more than 196,000 miles from Earth, to retrieve film canisters from the service module bay. It remains one of only 3 spacewalks in history performed that far from any planet. He'd made it to the moon on the same kind of mission that had once cut him loose 3 days before liftoff, and this time, nobody was calling him home early. That wasn't the end of his flying career. It was barely the middle. On June 27, 1982, Mattingly commanded STS-4 aboard the Shuttle Columbia, a 7-day mission that closed out the shuttle's 4-flight experimental test phase and the last one NASA would ever fly with a crew of only 2. Then, on January 24, 1985, he commanded STS-51C aboard the Shuttle Discovery, with pilot Loren Shriver and mission specialists Ellison Onizuka and James Buckley alongside him. The first shuttle mission ever dedicated entirely to the Department of Defense. A 3-day flight wrapped in enough secrecy that its classified satellite payload still isn't fully public. Post-flight inspection of that mission's solid rocket boosters found the worst O-ring erosion the shuttle program had recorded up to that point, a warning sign tied to the same cold weather vulnerability that would bring down Challenger a year later. One of Mattingly's own crewmates on STS-51C, mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, boarded Challenger almost exactly a year afterward, on January 28, 1986, and died with the rest of that crew 73 seconds after liftoff. The man who flew beside Mattingly through NASA's most secretive mission became one of the 7 names the program's worst morning is remembered for. 2 Apollo generations removed from Mercury, and Mattingly was still commanding brand new spacecraft on a flight that quietly foreshadowed the program's worst day. He carried Navy rank the whole time too, eventually reaching Rear Admiral, a title very few astronauts of his generation held alongside an active flight record. 1 Apollo mission, 2 shuttle missions, 3 flights that stretched from 1972 to 1985, 13 years apart on either end. When he finally left NASA, he didn't leave the industry. He went to Grumman to work on early space station concepts, then to General Dynamics in San Diego, where he took responsibility for the Atlas rocket program, still building the hardware other people would eventually fly. He died on October 31, 2023 at age 87. Here's the sentence that connects him to everything else in this story. His own Apollo 16 commander is the only other person in history who can say what Mattingly could say, that he flew to the moon and years later flew the shuttle too. That commander's name is on the record books in a very specific way, and the exact wording of that record is where this story goes next. The record is specific enough that it reads almost like a legal finding. John Young's own biography states it directly. He was one of only 2 astronauts, along with Ken Mattingly, his command module pilot during the Apollo 16 mission, to fly on both an Apollo mission and a Space Shuttle mission. Not roughly 2, not approximately 2. 2. And the standard is even narrower than it first sounds. It isn't just about flying an Apollo capsule in a shuttle orbiter. The precise cross-referenced language on both men's records says they are the only astronauts to have flown to the moon and also orbited the Earth on the Space Shuttle. That's a tighter net than it looks. Plenty of Apollo-era astronauts stayed on staff into the 1970s and 1980s, some training for years alongside shuttle candidates. Almost none of them ever launched again. Think about who that excludes. Neil Armstrong left NASA in 1971. Buzz Aldrin was gone by 1971 as well. Jim Lovell's NASA career ended in 1973. Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, retired from NASA in July 1976, 5 years before Columbia ever left the pad. The timing simply didn't line up for almost anyone else. Apollo ended its lunar flights in December 1972, and the shuttle didn't fly its first crewed mission until April 1981. That's close to a 9-year gap. To cross it, an astronaut needed to still be active, still be flying, still be trusted with a commander's or pilot's seat nearly a decade after the program that made him famous had already ended. Even the shuttle's own opening act was built for a skeleton crew. All 4 orbital test flights, STS-1 through STS-4, flew with only 2 men aboard, which meant just 8 seats existed in the entire bridge period, where an Apollo veteran could even try to make the crossing. Only 2 men threaded that needle, and because Gemini ended in 1966, Apollo ended in 1972, and the shuttle program itself flew its final mission in July 2011, that needle can never be threaded again. Nobody currently active in human spaceflight has an Apollo capsule to fly, and nobody ever will. Whatever this 2-person category represents, it is now permanently mathematically closed. A closed roster like that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of what these 2 men were living through, a national promise that started with 1 president, 1 speech, and 1 decade-long deadline. To understand what these 2 men were straddling, you have to go back to May 25, 1961, when President Kennedy stood before Congress and said this nation should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. That single sentence created an entire generation's purpose. A year later, at Rice University, Kennedy sharpened it into a line that became the era's motto. America was going to the moon, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. It wasn't a research proposal. It was a deadline, backed by the full weight of the federal government, aimed squarely at the Soviet Union, with a program office, a budget line, and an entire generation of engineers hired specifically to hit a date nobody had proven was even possible. Apollo didn't just change what happened in space. It changed how people on Earth saw their own planet. On December 24, 1968, Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders photographed the Earth rising over the lunar horizon, Earthrise, the first time humanity had seen its own world hanging alone in blackness. 4 years later, the crew of Apollo 17 photographed the fully lit Earth from deep space, the image now known as the Blue Marble. Those photographs fed directly into the environmental movement and the first Earth Day, observed on April 22, 1970. Neil Armstrong himself put the deeper shift into words at Apollo 11's 30th anniversary press conference in 1999, saying Apollo's real achievement was proving that humanity was no longer chained to the planet. People who had spent the 1960s watching astronauts leave the Earth spent the years right after learning, through those same astronauts' cameras, how fragile the planet actually looked from 250,000 miles away. Then, within a decade, the mission changed completely. Apollo had been about escape, leaving Earth, reaching another world, planting a flag, coming home to a splashdown in the ocean, a capsule that flew once and then went into a museum. The shuttle was about repetition, a spacecraft designed to land on a runway, get serviced, and fly again, and again. The same orbiter climbing back into orbit dozens of times over a working career. It wasn't a sprint to a single flag anymore. It was supposed to be routine. A space truck, a reusable machine meant to make orbit itself unremarkable. The opposite instinct from everything Apollo had been built to prove. That's the emotional distance Young and Mattingly crossed personally. They didn't just fly 2 kinds of hardware. They carried the romantic, deadline-driven urgency of the Kennedy era into a program built entirely around routine and repeatability, proving in their own flight logs that the dream Kennedy started didn't end when the last Apollo capsule splashed down in December 1972. One of these two men would go on to put that exact continuity into 6 words the day it all came together, and his story is the one this whole video has been building toward. One name is left on this roster, and he's the only human being who ever flew Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle, 3 separate American spacecraft programs, one career. John Watts Young was born September 24, 1930, in San Francisco, California, the son of a civil engineer whose work moved the family first to Georgia and then to Orlando, Florida, where Young graduated high school before earning an aeronautical engineering degree from Georgia Tech in 1952. NASA selected him as an astronaut in September 1962, part of Astronaut Group 2, after years as a Navy test pilot. What he did with that selection has no equal in the history of human spaceflight. NASA's own biography lists it flatly: Gemini 3, Gemini 10, Apollo 10, Apollo 16, the first flight of the Space Shuttle, and spacecraft commander of STS-9. 6 missions. The Smithsonian calls him the first person to fly in space 6 times, twice each on Gemini, twice on Apollo, twice on the shuttle. NASA's own memorial statement goes further, calling him the only agency astronaut to fly in the Gemini, Apollo, and Space Shuttle programs at all. His first flight, Gemini 3, on March 23, 1965, alongside Gus Grissom, was the first crewed test of the Gemini spacecraft, and Young became briefly famous for smuggling a corned beef sandwich aboard in his suit pocket as a gag gift, drawing an official reprimand from Congress for the stunt. On Gemini 10 the following year, he and Michael Collins docked with an Agena target vehicle and used its engine to push their own spacecraft to an altitude of 475 miles, a world record at the time. Young's Apollo record alone would have made him famous. He flew as command module pilot on Apollo 10 in May 1969, the dress rehearsal mission that took a lunar module to within striking distance of the surface without landing, proving out every piece of hardware 6 weeks before Apollo 11 finished the job. 3 years later, he came back as commander, and this time he didn't stay in orbit. In April 1972, Young landed Apollo 16 in the Descartes Highlands and became the 9th man to walk on the moon. Over 3 moonwalks totaling 20 hours and 14 minutes, Young and lunar module pilot Charlie Duke drove the rover nearly 27 kilometers across the Highlands and hauled back almost 96 kilograms of samples, including the largest single moon rock any Apollo crew ever brought home. But the image that outlived the mission itself wasn't a rock or a rover track. Here's where you need to see it, not just hear the dates. It's April 21st, 1972, on the lunar surface at Descartes. Young is standing beside the American flag his crew planted hours earlier, his suit stiff with the dust of the Highlands, the horizon a curve of gray under a black sky with no atmosphere to soften any of it. He's a Navy test pilot, 41 years old, and he has 1/6 of Earth's gravity working in his favor. He turns toward the flag, brings his hand up in salute, and then he jumps, both boots off the ground at once, body rising in a slow arc that would be impossible on Earth, suit and all, camera catching him mid-air with his hand still at his brow. NASA still catalogs that photograph today. Image AS16 113 18,339, captioned exactly for what it shows. Young leaping from the lunar surface as he salutes the flag. It isn't a posed portrait. It's a man who has waited his entire career to stand on another world, unable to stop his own body from celebrating it. Now hold that image, because 9 years later, almost to the season, the same man is strapped into a different kind of vehicle entirely. It's April 12, 1981, and John Young is in the commander's seat of the Shuttle Columbia on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, about to fly a spacecraft that has never once flown crewed before, no uncrewed test flight ahead of it, no dress rehearsal like Apollo 10 gave him. Just 2 men, a brand new reusable orbiter, and a design nobody had proven could survive re-entry with people aboard. NASA's own acting administrator, Robert Lightfoot, would later call STS-1 the boldest test flight in history. Young lifts off that morning as the same test pilot who jumped on the moon 9 years earlier, except now he's testing a spacecraft meant to land on a runway like an airplane, something no orbital vehicle had ever done before with a crew inside it. The ascent shakes the whole stack for the first 2 minutes, the solid rocket boosters burning hotter and rougher than anything in the Apollo stack ever had, and there is no escape tower above him this time. No way to yank the crew clear if something goes wrong in those opening seconds. Mission Control watches instruments nobody has ever seen live data from before. 2 days later, on April 14, 1981, Columbia glides down out of a clear sky over the Mojave Desert, and touches down at Edwards Air Force Base in California, landing like an airplane instead of splashing into an ocean the way every one of Young's 5 previous flights had ended. It rolls to a stop on the dry lake bed runway, and John Young, climbing out of a spacecraft nobody had trusted with a life until that exact moment, says the line Kennedy Space Center still preserves today as part of its official canon of American space quotes, right alongside Armstrong's "one small step and shepherds light this candle." Young looks at what he's just done and says, "The dream is alive." 6 words, which is the payoff this entire video has been building toward. The dream he's talking about isn't the shuttle program. It's the one Kennedy described on May 25, 1961, on a stage in front of Congress. Young is the one man who personally carried that dream from a launch pad in 1969 to a lunar highland in 1972 to a runway in the California desert in 1981. Moon dust on his boots in 1 decade. Brand new orbiter tires on the tarmac in the next. He wasn't finished either. On November 28, 1983, Young commanded STS-9, the first shuttle mission to carry the European Space Lab module, flying with a record 5 crewmates, including West German physicist Ulf Merbold, the first non-American ever to fly on a U.S. spacecraft. What was meant to be a 9-day flight stretched to 10 as the crew worked so far ahead of schedule that mission managers extended it, making STS-9 the longest shuttle mission flown up to that point. That gave Young 6 spaceflights total, spanning 3 completely different vehicles across nearly 2 decades, from his first launch in 1965 to his last in 1983. A record that stood alone until the 1990s, when Jerry Ross, Story Musgrave, and Franklin Chang Diaz each matched his 6-flight mark, and Ross finally broke it outright in April 2002, flying his 7th mission. Nobody who caught up to the number matched what Young had built across 3 generations of American spacecraft. Not the moon-to-orbit distance, not the sheer span of years. Young stayed at NASA for 42 years, an institutional lifespan almost nobody else in the astronaut corps came close to matching. He served as chief of the astronaut office from 1974 to 1987, the man responsible for deciding which crews flew which missions through the entire golden age of the shuttle program. NASA's tribute called him the agency's most experienced astronaut, a man whose career bookended itself with 2 first flights in brand new spacecraft. Gemini 3 alongside Gus Grissom in 1965 and STS-1 as commander in 1981. 16 years apart, and somehow the same test pilot's nerve running through both cockpits. He retired from NASA on December 31, 2004 at age 74, after logging more than 15,000 flight hours in his career. That long a career had to end somewhere, and it ended quietly, in a Houston hospital, on a January morning in 2018, which is exactly where this story turns next, to what happened after both bridge builders were gone. The last of the 2 died on October 31, 2023. Ken Mattingly was 87. He'd outlived his own Apollo 16 commander by 5 years and 10 months. Young had died first on January 5, 2018, also at 87, of complications from pneumonia in a Houston hospital. With Mattingly's death, the last living link to this two-person category disappeared entirely. Kennedy Space Center Director Bob Cabana marked Young's passing years earlier by placing a memorial wreath at the Heroes and Legends exhibit inside the visitor complex. The kind of quiet institutional gesture NASA reserves for its own. Young's 6 words from the STS-1 runway, "The dream is alive," are still preserved there today, curated by Kennedy Space Center alongside Armstrong's line from the Sea of Tranquility and Shepard's line from the Freedom 7 launch pad, part of what the center itself frames as a canon of American space quotes. Because here's what closes permanently with these two deaths. Gemini ended in 1966. Apollo's last lunar mission splashed down in December 1972. The Space Shuttle program flew its final mission in July 2011 and was retired for good. 3 programs, 3 endings, and no 4th program has ever bridged back to either of the first 2. Whatever astronaut flies next, on whatever spacecraft NASA builds next, they will never be able to say what Young and Mattingly could say. Not because of skill, not because of luck, because the hardware itself no longer exists to make the claim possible. There is no Apollo capsule left to fly. There will never be another one. The category isn't rare anymore, it's frozen, permanently, at exactly 2 names, and it will read that way in every archive from now on. What's left standing is institutional memory, not manufactured drama. NASA's former astronauts register keeps both men listed as substantial, standing entries in the agency's own historical record. The Smithsonian keeps Young's mission patches and flight record in public view, still describing him as one of a kind. Just missions, ranks, and a 2-man category that closed the moment the second man in it stopped breathing. There's a gap in this story you haven't gotten yet. You've heard what Young did on the Descartes Highlands in 1 paragraph, the jump, the salute, 6 words 9 years later. But that leap only lasted a fraction of a second on one afternoon out of 6 separate Apollo landings that each played out completely differently on the surface, with 6 different crews, 6 different sets of risks, and 6 sets of decisions ground control was making in real time while the world held its breath. What actually happened minute by minute during those walks on the moon across every single landing is the exact gap this video leaves open. Go watch every Apollo moonwalk explained, what really happened during each EVA, and see the rest of it.